From the inner sense of time comes the ancient poet's rhyme, bringing us the master key to open up the mystery. From the depth of time and space, we arrive in quiet grace, finding what is meant to be as we explore the mystery, pouring forth from days gone by. We can hear the poet sigh from the depth of ecstasy, moving into mystery. Hello and welcome again to Creative Connections, and my guest today is A. Keith Carreiro, and he is an author, a college instructor, and also a person who's thought a lot about the creative process. Keith, welcome.
Thank you.
So I first heard about you from Jan Lewis, who does Be My Guest in Upton, and she was telling me about your books. And right now you've got 2.
Correct.
Okay. And tell me about the books.
Well, it's a quest of mine to do 9 books, so
Okay.
3 trilogies. So the first trilogy is written and done. The first 2 books have been published. The third is being published as we speak. But what I'm also doing is I'm republishing the first 2. So they're going to be released at the same time on my birthday this summer, which is August 18th.
All right.
And it's going to be at Stillwater Books in Pawtucket, Rhode Island.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So what is the concept of the first trilogy?
The first trilogy, despite hints given throughout the 3 books, is that you think, and the characters think, the reader and the characters think, they're in England. But it's not England. It's Middle Ages, medieval times. But they're actually in a scientific experiment in the 26th century. So it's a hyper-reality experiment. It's also, for me, it's a thought experiment because there are physicists and philosophers who think that all of this reality is a simulacrum.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've read the first book, and exactly, I don't know if I exactly thought England, but it certainly had that medieval feel to me, and. It was interesting because, you've got also some very kind of mystical aspects going on as well.
Right. Now, the reason for that is, let me back up a little bit. The inception of this story started with me thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if I could take the premier scientist of America in 1776, Benjamin Franklin, and bring him into the 21st century and take him to Beijing, take him to Paris, take him to New York City, Boston, even where, downtown where, and watch the reaction. And I would think he might consider that he had been transposed by magicians.
Yeah. And
that he was in a world of miraculous, perhaps spiritual qualities because of how people have transcended nature. Mm-hmm. So the hubris on my part got nailed, because then I said, suppose somebody from the future nailed me and brought me into the future, what would I see? Would I have the same reaction? And the thinking was, yeah, I'd probably have the same reaction, but even more so, given the fact that if we survive, and when the technology continues to evolve, it would look like absolute magic. But then the presence of humanity and cyborgs and machines would be such, this is my guessing that it would be pretty much on its own. In other words, they wouldn't look to any other sources but themselves as the premier beings. So their sense of place in the universe was self-satisfied. There was no need for religion. There was no need for faith. There was no need for spiritual values. Science and technology handle that quite nicely.
Okay.
Plus, they came out of an apocalyptic period of time.
Okay.
So they turned their back on it. So their life extension is almost forever. But there's a quest that humanity has had for a long, long time to find immortality. And so it's eluded them. They cannot find the code for it. So their wiser heads decided, well, let's go back to the wisdom literature of the earlier times, and let's create a hyper-reality situation where we put people in spiritual crises, with the understanding that those that succeed use something in the DNA that nobody else does. And maybe that is the key to an algorithmic ruling in the genome that would lead them to immortality. There's no more nations, there's no more countries, there's 12 power bases, and they're fighting one another over this.
Okay.
So that's the rationale for the story.
All right. So going into it, you've planned it out as a 9-book series with basically 3 trilogies, right?
Correct.
Okay. So you going into it, I assume you had an idea of where it all ends.
Yes, it's in the form of a Russian doll.
Okay.
A Russian doll has a little doll,
Right.
then
and
another doll,
and
then
right.
another doll. It's recursive. It's kind of an ancient understanding that visual artists used when they would show like themselves painting, and there would be a mirror in back of them. And so you'd see the image repeating itself.
Right, right.
So where there's big fish and little fish, there's a bigger fish.
Okay.
So the second trilogy jumps up into the present time of the setting, which is 2562. And the next trilogy, the second trilogy, is going to be dealing with that time frame, and it's going to be dealing with this part of the galaxy, which is the Orion Spur on the Milky Way.
Okay.
And then the third one goes outside the galaxy and starts dealing with the universe.
Okay. So how difficult is it to create worlds that don't exist?
It's difficult if you don't do your homework, if you don't do your research, at least for me.
Right.
And for this first trilogy, in my computer, I have file after file after file of me trying to get a grasp of medieval times. What did they wear for clothes? How did they make the clothes? Where did they make the clothes? Where did they get their food? How did they grow it? How did they get the fruit to produce the various drinks, the cognacs, the ales, the beers, the hops, all of that, the weapons.
Okay.
Yeah, but this is a little bit more difficult because I have to say to myself, okay, so 500 years from now, what are people going to do? How are they going to act? What do they have for technology? That's a bit...
Right,
Yeah.
right. Because I'm sure, we all remember the Jetsons.
Yes.
And, the future that was promised to us. And it sure doesn't look like the Jetsons yet.
No.
So it's easier, I would imagine, to go back and research what was in the past. But it's much harder to
Yes.
then try to imagine what is in the future.
Yeah, so the research I've been doing is connecting with observatories, and I'm going to go visit the one in Bridgewater State University, where they're going to hopefully show me the Milky Way. And I've got 12 power bases. I've just figured out their names.
Okay.
I went and looked at the mythology. Basically, you've got the world nations that have gone into a diaspora.
Okay.
The first apocalypse, which I'm calling it, I've made a timeline starting from 12,000 BC that runs up until
Wow.
2562. And the first apocalypse occurred, they go from 12 billion people to 5 billion people. They go through a dark age, then they go through a resurgence, and then they start working on stuff that we haven't even gotten at. They discover uses for dark energy, dark matter, and in looking at all the nations that exist now, certain groupings in those nations, universities, corporations, syndicates, gangs, powerful families, they kind of coalesce through those nations, and they form off this planet, these 12 power bases, and I've got names for them. I've got their leaders. I've got their alliances.
Okay.
And now I'm drilling down even further, because in the second trilogy, I don't want to do a spoiler, something happens to the main hero, and it projects, I can't say it, something happens to him, it projects him into the present.
Okay.
So he gets out of the experiment, and the line that I have in my head is, how can a construct get out of its own way?
Ah.
And so the end of that story I already have in my head, which is a good thing. Like I had for the first trilogy, I actually wrote the ending first.
Okay.
But I'm waiting to put all the pieces together before I start writing, because I don't want to be in
right.
a vacuum, so to speak.
Sure. Do you find that your characters do unexpected things?
Yeah, they start fighting me. I'll plot that with the first trilogy. I was sailing along quite nicely, thank you very much. And I had two of the main male characters. One of them was going to kill the other. And I wrote right up to the scene where they're kind of like a Robin Hood, Little John incident at a river, and one was going to kill the other. I hadn't figured it out yet, and they basically said, "That's not going to happen." And I actually heard them talking to me and one another, and they said, basically, this is what's going to happen. We're going to have a loose alliance. We're not going to like one another. There'll be a fascination for one and the other, and then because of what's happening to them around them, they become Confederates, and then everything kind of gets blown up on them, and they get separated.
Okay.
But I knew when that happened, when they started talking back to me, that this was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It certainly seems like the characters come alive. And that's one thing I noticed in reading, is that the characters were not one-dimensional, as so often can happen.
Well, that's good.
And I can easily see where they might start saying, okay, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
So in talking to you and all this research you've done, you would think that you were into science.
The funny thing is, I like the theory of science, and I'm fascinated with how innovation comes about from first the idea theoretically, and then how the experimental physicist or the experimental scientist will take the theory and put it into practice or struggle through to it. So that, to me, that fascinates me, because I would call it breakthrough thinking. Mm-hmm. And we're also looking at how we get trapped into a certain way of thinking, a paradigm, and then all of a sudden somebody happens to come along and say, well, why can't you do this? And everybody goes, well, it can't be done. Then all of a sudden you see that it can be done, and so people start going, wow. So we live in an era now, at least in the U.S. And the free world, China, I'm sure Russia, India, Israel, where they have quantum engineering. So the level of development or evolution of the technology it's almost like the Richter scale. One point is 10 times greater than the other point. Mm-hmm. And if you do a chart of the evolution, you see that we're just increasing at a higher and higher rate.
Okay.
So if this is a chart here, and you have a curve, and the curve of development is like that, all of a sudden it goes up like that.
Okay.
And we're like at what's called a knee.
All right.
And so our sense of process of science and ideas we're sort of comfortable with, but our children and our grandchildren don't have that.
Yeah. So I was looking at your biography on Goodreads, And you wrote, it says, reading, music, storytelling, and movies became singular passions for him, all of which set him on a lifelong path of exploration and creativity. So what have you discovered in your exploration of creativity?
It's a good question. What kicked that off was my music.
Okay.
When I was 4 years old, I discovered a guitar, I didn't know it was a guitar, in my parents' basement. My mother was self-taught on the piano, so I would always hear her playing. And I sensed her passion for playing and what that brought in the house and the vibration of the music and all of the culture that was related to it. She did a lot of the hits of the 40s, the 30s, and the 50s at that time. Even the older music.
Yeah.
I didn't know that it was her guitar that she had used when she was, growing up in the 30s.
Okay.
But I remember that it was a bright sunlit morning, and there was a window in the basement with sunlight streaming through, and dust. I can remember the dust motes.
Okay.
And there were big cabinet doors, and I opened two of them, and I looked way in the back, and I saw something glimmer. Okay, and I didn't know what it was, so I crawled in there, and it was my mother's guitar, but I didn't know it was a guitar. Mm-hmm. And I grabbed it, brought it out, closed the doors, leaned it against the doors, the cabinets, and I remember my right hand going out and hitting the 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st strings. Now, it was totally out of tune, but I didn't know that.
Right.
And I was transformed by it. I don't know. I would call it a highly spiritual experience.
Okay.
Something kicked in, clicked, and I was transported. And I went and I got my mother, and I said, "What is this?" "It's my guitar. It's a musical instrument." I said, "Well, will you teach me it?" And she tried teaching me the piano, and it didn't work. My mother being my teacher, it just didn't work.
Yeah, that's always...
So she made me promise that if she found me a teacher, that I would continue the lessons. So she found me this teacher in Fall River, Massachusetts, called Joseph Raposo. And he taught me classical guitar from the age of 4 till I was 17.
Wow.
And I remember going into his studio in Fall River on North Main Street, which at the time was near Macy's. Cherry and Webb. It was the second floor studio. And when he sat down with me, he played Heitor Villa-Lobos's Preludio Numero Uno. And the same thing I had experienced when I hit those strings, I experienced, but it was quadrupled.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of a curiosity and an insatiable appetite for music, for composing, for being around people that did these things, and pestering them for stories, tell me stories.
Right.
So movies came along, painters came along, and I was just transfixed. So in the 70s, I toured through North and South America.
Okay.
Gigging out.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 77, I had to stop because I have something like Parkinson's.
Oh, okay.
So my career was ruined.
Ah.
And I actually became homeless for 2 years.
Wow.
Because I was in depression over all of this.
Right.
Lost a marriage, lost my home, everything. So I kind of reinvented myself. And I had a friend who said, "Why don't you go to Harvard?" And I said to him, "I'm too stupid and I'm too poor. That's just crazy talk." Now I was teaching 6th grade in Rehoboth, Mass at the time, and he was the psychologist for the district, one of the psychologists. So he kept pestering and pestering me. So to make him happy, I applied late, and got a letter from them nevertheless, and I held it up. And it was like 3 paragraphs I could see, and this is a rejection. I hate rejection, so I put it away. And then I opened it up, and I only read the first paragraph, and it said, "Congratulations, you've been accepted to Harvard's Graduate School of Education." So I threw a weekend party. And then people didn't believe me. They said, go get the letter. So I went and got the letter, and I read the other 2 paragraphs, and they said, the second paragraph said, congratulations, you've been given work study and tuition free. So all my arguments for I can't afford it disappeared.
Okay.
Right? So when I got there, and I also gave another 3-day party. When I got there, I discovered that I'd entered academic heaven. Because they let me put together a course, a curriculum on looking at creativity, because I said to myself, I had all this musical experience, I can't use it, I can't play anymore. I mean, I was close to suicide.
Yeah.
I saw no reason to go on because I thought my life was my music.
Right, right.
I thought that was my art was my music. And what I had to learn was my art is my life. Which sounds not much difference, but it's a huge difference, at least for me.
Yeah.
So based on that, I said, okay, now with a passion, I'm going to pursue this like I did music, like I did composing. And I wrote a lot of poetry. So let's do this. Let's take advantage of Harvard, the environment. Let's go to MIT. Let's look at the scientists there. I went into Edgerton Studios, did stuff on light. Edgerton was one of the people that worked on stop motion photography.
Okay.
And radar, I believe, during World War II. And I studied with a guy named George Prince that did tremendous work with creativity, and he created something called synectics, which some people call brainstorming.
Okay.
And so I tried to look at the performing arts, the literary arts, the visual arts, and then gradually scientific breakthrough thinking, and to see, using speculative philosophy, what tentative conclusions I could draw in terms of traits, characteristics, dynamics, patterns, and that's what I came up with. I came up with prescriptive elements in creativity and appraisive elements in creativity.
Okay.
And the prescriptive elements are basically your major forms. I've got it over here. I have to cheat. It's been a while since I looked at this. So your prescriptive elements are what I call the critical creative process. Management systems, rational cognitive systems, technical skills,
Okay.
Data, prose, overt skills, so that when you see somebody playing an instrument like Clapton playing, you're not concentrating on his technical skills.
Right.
The other stuff is overwhelming you. The spiritual side of what he's doing, the soulful side of what he's doing, the sheer music and the sheer art are coming through. But in order for him to do that, he has had to master the basics.
Okay.
So I've looked at skills analysis, functional awareness,
Wow.
Editing and prioritizing events, operant conditions in the environment, so how a person evaluates while they're in that process, making adjustments. Those are all sort of, how they go through a criteria. They're able to mentor themselves and adjust themselves cognitively.
Right.
And that's, for me, one side of it, one aspect of it. Even to call it a side is, I don't know if that's correct. But the side that I'm really interested in is what I call the Gestalt side, which is German for pattern.
Right.
And what people call the irrational or attitudinal skills. I call them dander, poetry, covert skills. And I didn't know how to use the language. It was very easy to use the language for the metacognitive areas.
Right.
The skill
Right.
side.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's got a great left hand, right? Because he's right hand dominant. He knows the fretboard. He knows his chords. He knows his modalities. He knows all of that. He probably doesn't even need to think about it.
Right.
It's just automatic. And he can gig with other musicians like that, and people love being with him.
Mm-hmm.
But that's operating at a tremendous level of expertise.
Right.
Right? And at the same time, he's got, because you can have a technical perfection, and have a soulless performance.
And yeah, I'm sure we've all seen that at one point or another.
Yeah. So what makes it, for me, what makes it interesting is in talking with people, where do they come up with their ideas? Do they dream it in their sleep? Does it come to them in a vision? Does it come to them in some form of rhythm? Does it come like an oscillation vibrancy that may be completely implicit, it may be inchoate, and yet something is pushing them towards scratching that itch.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so I talked about affective wondering, imaginative awe. Alfred North Whitehead, the English philosopher, many years ago said that the genius of the Greeks was their capacity for wonder. And I always, when I read that, see, I get goosebumps. When I read that, I said, that's amazing.
Great.
The capacity for wonder.
Yeah.
And if you lose that sense of wonder, you've lost the romance. There's no point in going on further because there's nothing there. There's no love.
Right.
So I thought that in this terms of being creative, in other words, you can be creative technically.
Right.
You can be creative emotionally, but that can render a lousy performance, and the technical aspect can render a lousy performance.
Right.
But you put the two together, and now you've got a matrix going that starts working on itself and becomes something incredible.
That is really, I love that thinking. And we're just about out of time. So what I do want to do is make sure we let people know where they can find, how they can find your books.
You can go on Amazon.
Okay.
And you can go to A. Keith Carreiro. You got my name up there.
Okay.
Carreiro. Or you can go on my website, which is www.immortalitywars.com.
All right.
And all the information is there.
And the release of the new book happens
August 18th.
August 18th?
Yep.
And that was going to be...
It's going to be at Stillwater Books in Pawtucket, Rhode Island.
Okay, not a bad drive from here.
No.
So I really would encourage people to do that. And I want to thank you all for tuning in and thanking Keith for coming in. And we'll see you again next time on Creative Connections. From the inner sense of time comes the ancient poet's rhyme, bringing us the master key to open up the mystery. From the depth of time and space, we arrive in quiet grace, finding what is meant to be as we explore the mystery, pouring forth from days gone by. We can hear the poet sigh from the depth of ecstasy, moving into mystery.